Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on childcare in the age of coronavirus national poll results. I'm Ann Hedgepeth, Senior Director of Government Affairs at Childcare Aware of America. Today's webinar is presented in partnership with Save the Children Action Network. You'll be hearing from both organizations in addition to hearing about the poll results. Before we get started, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items. First of all, I wanted to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and we will be making the recording available and sharing the resources in a follow-up email. Finally, please use the questions feature in your control panel to submit questions. We'll answer those at the end of the presentations and would be happy to address anything that comes up as you're listening to the results. I'm so pleased to see so many of Childcare Aware of America's partners, our state and local childcare resource and referral agencies, and other stakeholders who are a critical part of our movement for childcare on this webinar today. Like many of you, questions that are on my mind right now include, how can we best advocate for the needs of the childcare industry today and for the future? And do we have the widespread support we need for this effort to be successful? The poll results that we're releasing today tell us that momentum and public opinion are on our side. Americans overwhelmingly believe that childcare is a vital part of our lives and our economy, and that we need dedicated funding to make sure that we can weather this crisis. Voters understand that a strong childcare industry is essential to American economy getting back up and running, and they're sending a clear signal to Congress that childcare must be prioritized and receive support. Childcare Aware of America is eager to integrate these results from this poll into our advocacy efforts, and we hope you'll join us in doing so. I also wanted to share some of the other projects that we have underway to support childcare across the country right now in these challenging times. We've compiled and are frequently updating the latest coronavirus resources on our website, childcareaware.org. This information includes a resource hub for parents, for providers, and for policymakers with information from trusted sources. We have available an interactive map on childcare needs for essential workers during the coronavirus outbreak. And of course, we're supporting advocates by ensuring they have the ability to directly contact members of Congress through our website and urge them to provide more support for childcare in the next emergency relief package. All of these efforts will benefit from the learnings of the national survey results we're discussing today on this webinar. Now I want to pass things over to Roy at Save the Children Action Network to share more about their work and introduce the poll.
Thanks so much, Ann. Great pleasure to be with everyone here today. We were thrilled to be able to partner with Childcare Aware on this polling. As Ann mentioned, my name is Roy Chrobocinski. I am Director of Federal Government Relations for Save the Children Action Network. For those of you on the call that are not familiar with us, Save the Children Action Network, or SCAN, we are the advocacy arm of Save the Children. We've been in the U.S. we've been in existence for about 6 years now. We've done a lot of advocacy work at the federal level, and we're also on the ground in 10 states, helping to push for early childhood education improvements. I think historically we focused on building bipartisan support for improved access, affordability, and quality of early childhood ed programs. But as you're all aware, we are in unprecedented times right now, and I think because of everything that has happened, we and probably all of you on the call have had to pivot on the work that we've been doing in the past to address this new crisis head on. And so through groups like ours and Childcare Aware, and I'm sure many of you other groups on the phone right now, we're all really focused on trying to make sure that childcare survives this crisis and comes out the other end, because it is a backbone of a strong economy. We all know that in order to have a thriving workforce, in order for people to be able to go back to work, they need childcare. So childcare is the basic foundation for making sure that this economy can get back up and running. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we wanted to make sure that not only the people on this call, but that this was the feeling among a majority of Americans. And I think we were very pleased with what we saw in this polling data, now understanding and knowing for certain that there is really strong bipartisan support for making sure that the childcare industry comes out of this crisis intact. We have done a lot of work on this. I refer you to our website, SaveTheChildrenActionNetwork.org. If you want to learn more, if you again want to contact your members of Congress, we will have additional polling information up there as well. But please, we've also been collecting stories from people around the country, our vast supporter and volunteer network, both from the parent perspective as well as the provider perspective. Just a lot of different resources to see there. But I know I'm standing in the way of what you're really here to learn about, and so I do want to turn it over. We have been pleased to partner with TargetPoint, a Republican polling firm, and GQR, a Democratic polling firm, to do this public polling. We have worked with them time and time again over the past 6 years to produce public polling on a variety of topics. And really great pleasure to introduce Michael Meyers from TargetPoint to walk us all through the polling data and help us get a better understanding of where the American public, what they view as important for childcare in this crisis. So Michael, over to you.
All right, I think I'm off mute here, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for your time and attention. I will try to move through this expeditiously. I know we've got some time scheduled for this, but hopefully that'll leave us some time for some questions and answers. So feel free to share those questions. I think we're kind of using the question screen here to help facilitate that. So feel free to type them in as they come into your mind, and we may have to circle back to answer some of those, but we'll do our best to try to do that as well. So this survey is pretty fresh out of the field. We went in the field in the middle part of April. So this data is still pretty fresh, and we've worked a lot to try to condense this down. I always try to tell folks that a presentation like this should answer most of the questions of most of the people. So I hope we can accomplish that today. If we want to go ahead and move to the methodology slide, we'll just touch on that for folks that are into this piece of polling. This is a very high quality, very well done piece of research. The two partner organizations invested in doing this the right way. So we had 1,200 interviews across the country to look at. So a very healthy sample size to be able to look at and be able to look at some of the smaller demographic groups within the survey. We conducted at least 40% of the interviews on cell phones. So we've got a good representative sample of the entire country. And as I said, we're in the field the middle of April here, so we're still very fresh looking at this data. Anne did a great job of touching on the next slide of some of the key findings, and I won't spend too long on these, but just sort of reiterate that it's very clear that voters and Americans do see the vital role childcare plays. There's overwhelming support for specific financial assistance to the industry. That we were very specific to try to ask about, specifically to the industry and how best to, as both Anne and Roy, talked about of surviving this crisis. And so there's broad support for that specific assistance. There's also very broad support, surprisingly, in my mind, support for specific federal policies that could help get us through this crisis and help childcare come out better in the long run. And you're going to see as we go through this, the levels of support are so high that a majority of really every group that you can look at is supportive of these things. There's some groups that are more supportive and some groups that are less supportive, but there really are no opponents to this. So I think that the idea of timing and momentum and being able to take advantage of this is really right. That I think a lot of these results will hold up over the next several months, but I think this is a real key time in the process here. So if we want to just go ahead and take we did do a sort of look at the crisis itself, and we can share some of those findings in the next couple of slides. We asked a open-ended question of what pollsters would call an open-ended, where we didn't give you responses. We just asked folks, what is your biggest concern about the current pandemic? And you can see that there's actually a lot of different views that people have offered us if we take a look at that. So for instance, at the top there, 14% of folks gave us a straightforward economic argument that this is going to hurt the economy. I don't know how the economy will recover, those types of answers. We've tried to categorize all those individual responses into these. The next two that had 12 and 11% respectively were really very health focused. And as you went, if you were to go through and kind of study this page, you'd see that there's really four broad categories, and generally sort of split between those. Again, some a little bit higher, a little bit lower, but about 28% of folks were focused and gave us health-related questions or responses. A few points lower than that gave us economic concerns. Then there was a pretty good group right around that 25% that was very focused on sort of lack of preparedness and lack of response, that testing was lacking, hospitals weren't ready, those types of responses. Why don't we have enough enforcement? Those types of things. And then a little smaller group, 15-20% of folks gave what we would think of as sort of forward-looking, where they were already trying to think beyond what happens of, how do we recover? Or will the restaurants ever reopen? Will we have movies again? Too many businesses are going to go bankrupt. How do we save them? Those types of things. So there is sort of a variety of top of mind responses. And just like all of us, most people are probably thinking about all of these, but we try to push for the top responses on that. We then moved in to get a sense on the next slide of sort of where do the voters view the childcare industry in relation to other industries that have been the focus of potential assistance from the federal government. And I should just quickly note, I continue to say childcare industry, and I know that there's some debate, and we have done specific research on what best to refer to the industry. Prior to conducting this survey, we did do what we would call a pre-test, where we asked a smaller group of people just a single question of whether they thought various organizations, various different ways of saying the childcare industry, tested out. And childcare industry did come out a little bit above that. And I think that as we look through the data, it was pretty clear that when people were thinking of federal assistance and where does that money flow, that it does flow to industries, and that they do see this as different than simply flowing to small businesses or things like that. That it seemed fitting that the industry would receive federal assistance as opposed to teachers or childcare providers. All of those scored well, and I think that if anyone's out there using that language, particularly off the Hill, I think that will still resonate with people. But we did test that, so you will see the industry used throughout here, and that is on purpose, and it is a result of some quick additional testing we had done. So as you look at this slide, we had asked how catastrophic and damaging do you think that this pandemic will be to various industries? And you can see childcare comes in, really in the middle of a group of industries, all of which, certainly have, I think claims on both the American heart and minds and pocketbooks. So you can see travel and tourism comes in at the top as far as who will be damaged the most. Airlines just beneath that. Obviously, we could have argued that airlines are part of travel and tourism, but we did want to get that specifically, especially as we were going into the field. They were the subject of most of the discussions of federal assistance. Retail and restaurants came in just below that. And then a step down from that, childcare industry, but a pretty significant step up, especially if you look at, we'd ask people to rank these on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most damaging. So 34% of Americans said this is a 9 or 10 sort of level catastrophe for the childcare industry. Only 18% said the same for manufacturing. Only 14% said the same for oil and gas. So you can see that people do recognize that this is going to take a toll, and that these are not ordinary times. That these are not businesses that were poorly run in the past, and now we're looking for a handout. That they recognize that the pandemic is causing real damage to a variety of industries, but certainly recognize within the childcare industry. And I thought it was encouraging for our efforts to see us rank above, especially manufacturing. Oil and gas doesn't necessarily have, as many warm and fuzzy feelings as hotels or restaurants or retail shops. But certainly manufacturing has a hold on the country, and a lot of people are connected to that. And the fact that we are, almost 2-to-1 on the level of concern for the industry is very encouraging in my mind. So that sort of lays sort of a groundwork of what the country is feeling at the moment on the pandemic. And then we began to dig in a little bit deeper on the next couple of slides, taking a look at what is the country's experience with childcare. So we asked everyone who told us they had a child, regardless of how old they were. So these could include, grandparents at this point that had children, 35, 40 years ago. And across the country, 55% of folks had said that they had, at some time or another, the parent stayed home with the child. Almost 40% said that they had taken advantage of regular attendance at a child care facility or in home. 36% relied on family members or close friends, and 11% cited that they had an au pair or nanny at some point. If we take a look just at folks prior to the pandemic, so families that actually have children in the home on the next slide, you'll sort of see the current state of play. So 40% said that just prior to the pandemic that 40% of people that have children in the home, so in this case, this would be under 18, 40% were relying on parents, 28% relying on child care, professional child care, 16% on extended family members or close friends, and 4% in that nanny or au pair category. The 12% that are none of the above, most of that is people that the children are now old enough that they didn't feel that they needed childcare. So that just sort of sets a level, and part of what we wanted to look at is, that if only 28%, I know these numbers will vary and different folks will have different numbers, but if we say broadly that 20 or 30% of people are actually accessing the industry and using it, can we build support beyond that? Is there support beyond that, or is this just going to be a sort of walled garden effort? And you start to see pretty quickly that it's not a walled garden effort. On the next page, we see the impact on families themselves. So half of parents who had kids under 18 said that their childcare had been disrupted by the pandemic, which obviously corresponds to the folks that were at home. Most of those folks said that it hadn't changed, even though I'm sure they were impacted by that. So about 1 in 5 said that the childcare was no longer available. 1 in 4 said that they were no longer sending because of safety concerns. Those two could probably be conflated at times with each other. And 5% had said that it was available, but hours had been restricted. And then I think one of the key slides is this next one that I do think we have to keep in mind for our messaging, and as you work your advocacy, especially with folks that aren't natural allies, as we reach out beyond our natural supporters, that the country is focused on childcare as an economic engine. So we asked people thinking broadly about the impact of the pandemic on childcare, what's a greater concern to you when we come out of this? That the children may not have access to quality childcare after the pandemic is over, or their parents may not be able to find childcare and would prohibit them from returning to work. The majority of the country, by a fairly significant margin, thought that that sort of economic argument was their top concern. And you can see 21% chose both, even though we didn't give them that option. So there are a lot of people focused on the quality as well. But I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that especially right now, and especially as we're asking for this assistance or advocating for the assistance, that this is an argument of powering the economy, empowering families. We're going to look at some of the messages, the pro-family messaging in here. Really does help carry the day through here. So let's take a look now at some of the specific assistance questions we asked over the next slides here. So we asked a range of different policies that the federal government could enact to help the industry. from a standard polling sort of setup, what we look for with our clients is any issue that gets over 35% in the strongly support categories is something that hey, I think we can go push for. I think we can make this work. Anything over 45% that also gets 2/3 of the country behind it is a very good score and gets pretty rare these days. So the fact that we have 5 issues here that get more than 50% strong support, that have more than 3/4 of Americans supporting it is really pretty remarkable. I think some of that is a direct relation to the current pandemic and people's willingness to support a variety of these things, but it also clearly demonstrates that the importance of childcare has become clearer to many people that are not directly impacted by it, that this is well beyond that 20 or 30% of folks that are actually accessing childcare today in a formal way, that they recognize that this is an important piece of this. So the highest testing issue on here, you almost hate to rank these, again, if all we had to work with were the bottom 2 policies, I would feel like those are good policies to be able to go advocate for, and we should be able to convince Congress and state and local leaders to support similar policies. So I would not discount these ones that come in a little bit lower, but it's hard to ignore what's at the top. So should we be providing enough support during the crisis so that current child care providers are able to make payroll and pay other expenses such as rent and utilities? Overwhelming support for that. Roughly 6 in 10 folks say yes, absolutely, I very strongly support that. That is a rare number to see on almost anything, especially today. 87% of the country totally supporting that. Only 1 in 10 pushing back and saying, no, I don't know if that's such a good idea. Should we reimburse essential workers for childcare costs paid during the coronavirus pandemic? Again, over 50% of the country is saying they strongly support it. 78% in total support that. You can see about the same levels of support for those next several policies. Providing increased pay to the child care workers who continue to offer services for children to frontline workers, strong support for that. Expanding the footprint of the child care industry to places where it may not be available. Again, a majority of Americans feeling very strongly supportive of that idea. Emergency funding to provide child care in the event of a future economic crisis, strong support for that. Provide increased compensation for child care workers to ensure a high quality workforce. Again, I don't want to undersell the value of this and the strong support that's there. That 44% number is a very good number. That 76 is especially strong. The fact that very few people would advocate or agitate against that is very strong. And then even that last issue there would certainly qualify as an issue that traditionally would be more in the top, at least in the middle at 36%, of reimbursing parents for fees they paid for childcare, even though it wasn't available during the crisis. I was a little surprised that you could see that number that high. I suspect most Americans may not be aware that that's actually happening. So that was, I think a higher score than I might have predicted as we went into this. And again, I wouldn't want to downplay the value of any of these. If these are all viable policies to be pursued, and I think ones that members of Congress, again, the sort of companions that any state or local governments might be considering would want to look closely at. We went ahead and put on the next couple of slides just some breakdowns so you could sort of see where different groups of voters fall on some of these different policies. So if we go to this offers a little thumbnail sketch of what we're talking about here. So looking at those same policies you were just looking at on that last chart, if we take a look across some of the different traditional dividing lines in American life, you can see that there's broad consensus for the payroll support during the crisis, making sure that the lights stay on and that rent can be paid. On the next page, you'll see is essentially the top issue for almost every age group, every partisan group, gender, race, across the line. That's the top scoring, the most popular policy that we saw there. We do see younger voters actually gravitating towards making sure that it's expanded to areas that need it as their top issue. And then you do start to see a variety of responses of the second most popular policies that could be pursued depending on these different demographic breaks. So you can see, for instance, Republicans are more likely to gravitate towards the reimbursing essential workers, whereas Democrats and independents like the expansion of the footprint argument. So you can see just some differences there across the line. There were a couple of groups that had ties for second place, so we included more than one issue there. So you can see as people age, they begin to look a little bit more like Republicans. I certainly wouldn't argue that partisanship is gone during this time. We're seeing lots of evidence of partisanship, but it is not extending to the support for this industry and where it's at. So a lot of strong support there. The next page kind of takes a look at a few other groups that folks may be interested in, broken down by education, whether or not they have children in the home and how old those children are, marital status and income. Again, some slight variations between what they like the best, what they like second best, how they rank order these. But again, the thing I would emphasize is that everyone supports all of these in some form or another. It's just a matter of degree. So I think that's all very encouraging and gives us a lot of runway to be able to talk to a lot of people that we may not traditionally have been able to reach out to. We did do a quick look at pushing for universal childcare. If we go to that next slide, we can take a look at that. And here I think is one place where we would want to have a little caution as we look at the polling. We tested the phrasing of this in two different ways to get a read on both the best possible ways to advocate for these policies as well as the overall support levels for them. So when we call it a universal child care system, we get a pretty close call, even in this heightened environment of support for the industry. It's at 53-43. When we do get higher levels of support, rather than calling it universal child care, that we say, would you support or oppose switching to a system similar to public schools where child care is available to all parents who need it and choose to use it without needing to pay for it? So it seems clear to me that this concept of universal child care is probably getting caught up in the idea of universal health care, especially when we look into the crosstabs. You see Republicans much more strongly opposed to the idea of universal child care than they are to sort of an extension of the public school system. So the 63-33 number is certainly encouraging, but it is several degrees lower than what we see on all of our other issues. So I think as a community and as an advocacy group, we want to be careful of exactly how hard we push for that concept, how much we want to push for that today. That 1 in 5 people do strongly oppose that, even as most people told us that they were very supportive of support for the industry on broad levels. I think this is a spot where it does raise a yellow flag, at least of caution, in how far we want to advocate for the sort of best case universal coverage after the crisis is over, and how we go about doing that. That's not sort of the same easy case to take to Congress as most of those other policies we took a look at. So if we sort of go back to the idea of on the next slide, taking a look at financial support for the industry and what would that look like. We gave people sort of the context setting of that many industries are looking for assistance, and we used the airlines as an example of that. And we asked them whether or not they would support the idea of the childcare industry receiving targeted financial assistance from the federal government, or would you oppose the use of federal funds for this? So here again, you see 80% of Americans saying, yes, I support that idea. I think that's the right thing to do. 50% strongly supporting that. Our strongest groups, minorities and millennials, really high on that. And again, as you'd expect, and as we've all seen, generally the more liberal you are, the more supportive you are. The more conservative, the less supportive you are. But still, big majorities of Republicans, conservative Republicans, Trump Republicans, primary voting Republicans supporting these concepts here. If you take a look at the next page, again, you can see sort of some advocacy levels of support. No surprise that recent childcare users, people that have been impacted, parents with children under 18, are a strong advocacy group. Working with local providers, working to have them help send this message, I think would obviously be an important piece. Notes home in backpacks for children as they return. Emails to families, that type of stuff. I think encouraging our actual frontline providers to be encouraging advocacy can help go a long way through here. If we kind of take a look on the next slide of what are these child care age parents. So we took a look at parents with children under 11 and under as sort of the prime demographic for what they could look at. And what are they concerned about when it comes to the virus? They are concerned about opening up too soon. They're not screaming to get the doors open on businesses right now. They're concerned about the safety of their family and friends. They're concerned about availability of testing. And you can see that they're clearly impacted if their childcare providers were not able to reopen or unable to hire sufficient staff. I'd have to stay home for a few weeks until they pick back up. Again, there's sort of this idea that maybe that I think even most of us that are taking advantage of childcare don't realize how tenuous staffing can be in some of these places, that it may not be a matter of just wait a couple weeks and things will turn around. We'd have to figure it out. That was the line that we got from a lot of folks. We'd have to figure it out. Almost a sense of like, I don't know. Obviously, we'd have to figure something out, but I don't know what I would do. Big supporters of federal assistance, 85% total support. Policies that they were most focused on, again, a little bit different than the country as a whole. So again, that they were focused on that top policy that is essentially everybody's top policy. But then they did gravitate as their second issue to the idea of ensuring a high quality workforce. And so I know that's an issue that SCAN in particular has spent a lot of time trying to work on, and that all of us are focused on prior to this crisis. And it's one that especially these prime childcare user groups are focused on. And then you get a sense of some of the messages. I want to go ahead and take a look at some of the messages and how those played out. So we tested in total 7 different messages that could help us sort of solve this concept and advocate on behalf of these policies. We split them up into 2 different slides, and again, you want to resist the temptation to look at the second slide as bad messages. They're just not as good as the other messages. So again, the same metric here. Anything over 35 is something I want to find a way to use. Anything over 45 is a very strong message. I think if we can go back one slide, we'll look at the top group there. So you can see you've got 3 messages that meet that 45% criteria, and then one that really stands out. We see very, very few messages asked to the American public that get these kind of numbers of support. And I think that I'll read the message out for anybody that maybe either can't read that or isn't at their computer. It really does sort of tick off, I think, what the essential building blocks for advocacy are. So childcare is essential for many American families to be able to return to work. So I think that word essential is an important piece of this. American families are an important part of this. Family budgets are already being strained, as many have been without work or had a decrease in income because of the virus. There's a short message, but it packs a lot in there. It lets us get inside people's homes, lets us sort of envision them at the kitchen table trying to figure out how to balance budgets. And we need to ensure that all childcare providers are able to open as soon as it's safe to do so that families are able to get back to work as soon as they're able. That evokes both a lot of empathy while also making a strong economic argument, a strong essential worker argument why we need these policies in place. So that is clearly a step above all of the other messages. And even though all of the other ones are very good, that one really does pack a punch and gets a lot into a fairly limited number of words. So I think it's, as you look at digital outreach, as you look at phone calls, as you look at scripts to try to build support for this, trying to pack in and get both that essential economic argument, but also bringing in, letting people think about the families dealing with these issues, the waitresses, the doctors, the nurses, the utility workers that are out there working on this and as they try to get back to work, how important childcare is for each of them. The next argument focuses a little bit more on the people within the industry. Makes a little bit colder of an economic message to that, and that works. People are focused on the economy, as we talked about. Even today, about 1 in 4 are more focused on the economic impacts than the health impacts. And so you can see that is playing out here. The third argument there, again, is sort of an essential worker type of an argument. Again, it works very well. If we had not thought to get this first issue in there, we'd be very pleased by the number 3 scoring issue in our set, that also works. That 1 in 10 parents had to quit a job or not take a job or change job because of problems with childcare. Those numbers will only balloon if care providers are forced to close because of lack of funding, and more parents will be left struggling to make ends meet. Again, it helps provide both an economic and an empathetic argument through here. The next arguments focus on the child care providers themselves. That nearly half of all providers said that they could not survive more than 2 weeks of closure without support. We've yet to reach the peak of the pandemic here in the United States. Congress needs to act now to set aside funding for child care. A big majority of Americans support that, well over 70%, 43% think that that's a strong argument to be made, a convincing argument. On the next page, again, you'll see the 3 lowest scoring, but again, all viable, good arguments. The thing I would point out is, again, is a good argument. 63% of Americans right now find that a convincing argument, but just simply focusing on quality of care does not build us the same levels of support as when we're able to make both that empathetic argument and the economic and the essential worker type of arguments there. So I certainly wouldn't want to leave those off the table. They do have an impact, but I think leading with the economics and while then making a quality argument where that makes sense is the right pattern to go with on some of those messaging questions. So finally, at the end of all of this, we asked what we would in polling terms call a post ballot, so we can measure movement. I think if we had known that there would be such high levels of support, we may have skipped this question. But sometimes you're never quite sure what answers you're going to get. So we wanted to see what movement looked like. With levels of support this high, on the next slide, you'll see there was really very little movement overall across the country. That after these messages, you still have roughly 8 in 10 folks supporting the message. You do get a little bump up on the strongly supportive. You go from 50 to 52. As you discuss this with people, it's not, especially when you start with numbers in the 60s, 70s, 80s. As you expose them to all these messages, there'll be some people, again, more conservative than liberal, that will start to wonder, like, oh, what is this all going to cost? Boy, this seems like a lot. You're asking me all these questions. Maybe I'm not as supportive as I was. So you see a few people tick off with there. So you go from 80% total to 77, but no real meaningful movement. And essentially it cancels out. 14% of people moved in the right direction. 14% of people moved in the wrong direction. So this is a matter of getting the right messages to the right people and really just trying to take advantage of this advocacy window as best we can. So if we try to distill all of this down as you're advocating for support on the next 2 slides, I think from a messaging standpoint, you want to look at what's both what is most popular and what's most persuasive. In this case, we try to push clients to look at that most persuasive information. Here with numbers this high, the most popular may actually be a better road. So if you think of most popular, I sort of generally describe that as what's the fastest way to get a room full of people to shake their heads and agree with me. So if you make these 2 arguments, we can get about 80% of Americans to shake their heads up and down and say, yes, I think this is a good idea. We need targeted financial support from the federal government for the childcare industry. So that most popular, again, the idea of direct support to the industry so that childcare can reopen when it's ready, that the American family needs this, that it's an essential piece to that is really key. And then talking about the people that are employed in the industry and how important they are, that they are providing an essential service to countless American families, that we need to be there for them. Those are the 2 fastest ways to get people's heads wagging. Those people whose head don't immediately begin wagging, essentially the people that aren't on our side yet, if we're actively engaged in persuasion efforts, so if you're talking to skeptical audiences, in this case that somewhere between 10 and 20% of people that are skeptical, these are the most persuasive arguments. So the idea that most childcare providers told us that they could not survive 2 weeks without assistance proved to be more persuasive to the group of people that weren't already with us. That childcare should be viewed as a core infrastructure in the United States and should be funded as such. Without childcare, a large portion of the workforce would be unable to return to work. Those were the two most persuasive arguments. So depending on what type of discussion you're having with folks, you want to think through which of those is best. And then our final slide, and again, I kind of give credit to the partner organizations for being willing to ask sort of the tough questions through here, of getting a sense of as hard as it is for the American public and even I think the average congressman to wrap their heads around the scale of this crisis and the amount of support that's needed from the federal government. We did try to get some expectations set of where people thought an actual number could land at. So we gave people the airlines as an anchor and told them that for reference, the airline industry has been given $32 billion in financial assistance so far. How much do you think the childcare industry should get? So we asked that just as a straight open-end question. Many people, as you would expect, told us that they didn't know what the right number was. So we then asked those people, well, do you think that they should get more than the airlines, less than the airlines, the same as the airlines? So when you add up those two responses, about 25% of voters thought that the industry deserved more than the airline industry. 63% said less than that. Depending on how you like to look at averages and means and modes and those types of things, and medians, roughly the average response was between 20 and $30 billion to the industry. So just underneath the airlines, and I think I know there's broad discussion within the advocacy groups of what the right number is and how to advocate for that. So that there certainly is levels of support, for direct assistance. But I think we also want to temper what the ask is for and keep in mind that especially as we move into recovery and out of the immediate crisis mode, that some of the appetite for fully funding the needs of all of these industries will begin to temper a little bit. So just I think a very smart, consistent reality check of where the American public feels priorities should line up. And it really matches up with one of those first slides we looked at, that very clear that this is an important piece of the economic puzzle to most Americans, but also not at the very top, that it is an issue that needs some temperance on as we look to move through here. So that's a lot to throw at a group, especially in sort of a remote voice droning on here. I'm not sure the best way to try to go at questions through here, but I hope this has been helpful to folks and provide you some support through your advocacy efforts.
Thanks, Michael. This is Anne. We so appreciate your sharing these findings. I think they're, to your point, very powerful and very helpful to the advocacy efforts. My colleague Jake has been monitoring the questions as they are coming in, and I think can lift a few of those up to you. Just to remind everyone that if you have a question about the survey results, how to interpret them, some of the methodology behind the survey, please feel free to put your question in the questions box in your control panel, and we will lift them up over the next few minutes. Jake, are there any questions that you wanted to put to Michael or to me and Roy based on what you're seeing come in from folks who are watching?
Yes, there are. Thank you, Anne. I will start off with, there's a few questions just about the data. So the first, I'm kind of combining a few questions here. How many states participated in this survey, and is there a way to disaggregate the data by state?
Take myself off mute. This was a national survey, so each state is certainly represented within the data. Most states would not have, so there were 1,200 interviews across the country, distributed in roughly equal proportions to their population. So most states, we would not be able to plot individual states, but we could look at regions. So if we wanted to look at responses within the Midwest or the Western United States, if we wanted to look, California would probably have enough, Texas, New York could have enough. Some of the larger states we could certainly take a look at. So if people have some particular regional breaks they'd like to take a look at, or if some of those larger states make some sense, we could certainly pull that together for folks.
Great. And just to follow up, we did have a question about if they could be split up by regions too. So that sounds like something that is of interest. Yeah. There's a question about families that participated in the survey. If there's a way to find out if they were 1 or 2 parent households, or if they had children, is there a way to find out more information about the families that participated?
Yeah, there is. So we asked both marital status and whether there were children in the home, and then a range of ages. We didn't ask for their exact age. So we could, for instance, take a look at single parent households with kids under 18, and compare those to either people without children at home in the same age groups, or however we want to take a look at that. That data is all available.
Great, thank you.
Put that into a spreadsheet for folks to take a look at.
We have a few questions about discussing childcare in relation to K through 12 school. If there's sort of data about support for public schools and kind of the K through 12 funding infrastructure, and if there's data. I know this was a little bit in the presentation, but if you could expand on how to kind of leverage childcare in that support.
We did test. That probably and has been subject of a lot of research of how to work at that. We did ask that one specific question on sort of bringing this into the traditional public school setting. And there was support for that. There was also, there was majority support, but also it was the only thing we saw real strong opposition on as well. So I think that is the case that will continue to have to be made probably after this immediate crisis fades and into the fall and maybe to next year, as we continue to make those arguments. There is support for that. I think this is a good time to be talking about those types of issues and those types of frameworks for funding, but I would just caution that it is even our limited data would indicate that it's a significantly heavier lift than the other policies that we tested.
Great. There is a question here about the difference between federal and state support and actions, and if perceptions differ when you say federal support versus state policy or state assistance support.
Those are good questions. I think that I think it does probably matter. In this survey, we focused solely on, we phrased these as essentially as federal policies. I think that there's a pretty good ability to translate that to the state and local level. I think budget realities at the state and local levels may begin to start to interfere with some of these as time goes on. But I think that in the past, getting the federal government involvement in this has been more difficult than state and local. I think that may be one thing that the pandemic has changed a little bit, is that people are more willing to accept federal funding and the role of the federal government in what are traditionally state and local decision making. So I think it's and this is something that the survey does not fully answer, but kind of read between the lines a little bit of that it's an odd situation where we're accepting the federal government's role in this right now, maybe one of those things that changes as time goes on. And so again, I think the idea of trying to capitalize on this moment is important, where people are willing to accept the role of the federal government in here, and that the federal government seems to have some ability to provide these resources to folks.
Great,
This is
thank
Roy
you.
with SCAN. Just wanted to hop in there because I know working with Michael in the past, we have done the testing of the federal versus like state and whose responsibility is childcare back in simpler times when there weren't pandemics and state shutdowns. And I think at that time, we did see people more interested in the states stepping up and taking the lead. But I think Michael's right that, we are seeing a real shift here in the focus and the willingness for people to accept federal assistance and the role of the federal government. And I'd have to go back and dig through some of those older surveys. And of course, things change over time. These surveys, other polls were conducted, months and years ago. But I think, there is in this survey that more of a focus on the federal aspect of the support, knowing that in the next 6 to 12 months, states are going to be coming to terms with some really difficult budgetary decisions, and the federal government's ability to print money seemingly without end at this point makes it a little bit easier to go to the federal government for assistance.
Great. Some of these next questions are within the realm of advocacy and messaging. So, and Roy or Michael, whoever feels can answer, feel free to chime in. We have one question about if there is a plan to put together a social media toolkit or some infographics so that folks can share with legislators.
Yeah, this is Anne. I would start by saying that I hope folks who are interested in sharing the results that we've shared today will go and follow both Child Care Aware of America and Save the Children Action Network on Twitter, where you will see that we've been sharing some infographics and some information about the poll over the past week. Those are, there for your use, and we hope you'll amplify those messages. We are also developing some resources that we hope will be useful moving forward, including things like share toolkits. Child Care Aware of America is hoping to publish a blog. We all have some top line messaging available on our website, so that's both at childcareaware.org and Save the Children Action Network's website. Roy, are there a few other things that you want to mention in terms of the way that we'll be pushing out these resources for people to use?
Yeah, I think you've covered most of it. I know that our comms teams and we are still working on putting together documents, both Hill-facing and public-facing. And so as we get those finalized and signed off on, as I'm sure many folks on the call are aware with internal organizational bureaucracy, once those things are completed, I'm sure we'll circulate those as well. And so, as Ann said, keep an eye on our website and on our social media for when those things are ready. We will be sure to share them more broadly, and even in additional follow-up emails from this webinar. I know folks were asking about getting a copy of the slide deck. We will be sure to send that around, and as materials come available, we can also hopefully be able to package those and send them around as well.
Great, thank you. There's a question on whether or not in this survey or if there are other surveys that express the needs coming from the childcare industry. So if there's any way to combine the information from this survey with any statistics or data that comes from the childcare field itself.
This is Roy. I'm sorry. I know NACI has done a fantastic job, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, in getting out to childcare providers and getting a survey of what they're experiencing in the field, how long they'll be able to survive with or without federal funding. And so they have been going out bi-weekly at this point, getting that information. And so those resources are out there and available. I don't know, we haven't really talked through how to package it all together in one space, but there are definitely conversations happening to make sure that all of these different resources are available to folks out in the field and to other groups as well. And so I turn it to Ann if she has any other thoughts on how we best get that out.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because, we, in thinking through this poll going out in the field when it did, we did try to make sure that the policy actions we were asking about they reflected what the surveys and the Macy survey that Roy mentioned, what the types of information that Child Care Aware of America was hearing from stakeholders in the childcare industry. What are the needs? And so that is part of what shaped the idea that we're asking about making sure that providers can make payroll or cover their mortgage or things like that. But those needs are also evolving. And I think that that's a reality that our advocacy is going to have to adapt to. So these sort of big picture messages in the survey, I think, are incredibly useful, even as we learn more about what providers and the system overall and the infrastructure needs from a robust investment in future funding. It may still be, what does it look like to keep the lights on and to ensure that providers are there to help the economy reopen. It may also be that that robust funding is in part those day-to-day needs like sanitation and supplies, which we didn't dig into all the nuance and detail around, but the overwhelming support for the industry, I think, tells us that we're able to talk about these needs as they evolve. I don't know if Michael would disagree with me, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to find that the advocacy can adapt and utilize the big picture buy-in, even as we're all pivoting to needs in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I would not disagree with that. I think that's right.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions about messaging the information in here to policymakers and legislators. So I guess generally speaking, do these responses align with what we're hearing from federal legislators? And is there a plan from both organizations to share this with federal legislators, and how can we be more involved in helping lift this up to federal legislators?
This is Roy. I'll go first, but Anne, please feel free to fill in the gaps and other information. Yes, there is a plan to share this with federal legislators. We have not done so yet, but we are getting our materials together again and rolling those out to make sure that legislators are aware of their of how constituents across the country feel about the importance of childcare and the assistance that childcare deserves and needs in this crisis. I think both of our organizations do a phenomenal job in reaching out to legislators through their constituents, through their grassroots. And so I'd recommend going to either of our websites, SaveTheChildrenActionNetwork.org or to Child Care Aware's website. And I'm sure that there are actions that can be taken there to contact your legislators. I know we are working on putting together, again, as talked about earlier, social media toolkits and other actionable items that can be flagged for legislators, and we'd recommend to take this information and call your legislators, let them know. I think there's many different ways to get involved here, and please view us as resources and tools to help drive this information to the people that need to be educated.
Yeah, this is Anne. I would completely agree with Roy, and I think you'll already start to notice that many of us are trying to wrap some of these messages and findings into the resources that we're putting together as early as this week. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that both of our organizations are going to be really leaning into advocacy in the coming weeks around sort of events that had maybe historically been in person that we're pivoting to provide virtual opportunities for. Child Care Aware of America has our virtual symposium on Monday the 4th. So coming up, there is still time to register today and I think tomorrow if you're interested. But as a part of that effort, we will be connecting the dots between this polling and being able to take action from home. That is, a sort of re-understanding of what was a day on the Hill or advocacy day in the past for the organization, but still making sure that our voices, which are much stronger and more powerful together, are heard collectively next week, and that they reflect some of these powerful messages that we've learned through this polling data would be effective in our work. And so I would encourage you all, again, to Roy's point, to stay tuned for the resources that we'll all be rolling out in the coming weeks that will integrate these messages, but also deliver the findings to policymakers as appropriate. We're also interested in what partners and advocates on the webinar today can do to integrate the messages and utilize them in their advocacy. So let us know. Our contact information is on this last slide that's up. If there are projects that you're working on that Roy and I can support, and additional information that we can work with Michael and our partners around the survey to help with, that's what we're here to do. We want these results to serve the needs of the advocacy community and help us all work towards our big picture goal of securing additional support for the childcare industry in the efforts that Congress is taking.
And so much better at this than I am. I also forgot to mention, yes, we were supposed to be actually having our Hill Day today. Our advocacy summit in person was supposed to be, this was the culminating day in normal times. So we too have gone virtual starting this Thursday at 8 p.m. For an hour, and each subsequent Thursday we will be having a virtual summit series. Again, go to our website, check out the information there. You can register. Each week is on a different topic that Save the Children Action Network advocates for. So the third week, May 14th, at 8 p.m. Eastern, that will be our week that is focused on early childhood education. But again, go to our website, figure out, which, if any of these seminars or webinars you want to register for. But again, yeah, we are taking this all virtual, similar to what Child Care Aware is doing. And yes, love to hear what folks in the field are doing as well, and how we could be highlighting the work that is happening back in the States.
Awesome, thank you. And looking at the questions, I think a good final question here is there a way for folks to dig into the results or any sort of reports based on this survey? Is there a place for them to go? And what can they do if they have more questions on it?
Yeah, this is Anne. So we have both Child Care Aware of America and Save the Children Action Network have the top line results of this survey already posted on our website. So you can go and find our press releases announcing the poll results and find the memo that summarizes the major takeaways. Child Care Aware of America is also publishing a blog today that, again, focuses on those top line messages. But knowing that participants on the webinar today are probably interested in digging in to many of the details that we covered here, we will be sending around the deck and a recording in the next few days. It takes us a little bit of time to get that recording downloaded and get things together for you all, but we will be distributing those so that you can use them. I think Roy alluded to this as well. We're constantly, I think, collaborating on what next steps in terms of resources that we'll make available for your advocacy. So stay tuned for additional follow-up and to our websites for other resources that may be useful.
And got it all, nothing else.
Perfect.
Oh, go ahead. I was just wrapping up.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jake. Thanks for facilitating that. I appreciate everyone who asked questions. If we weren't able to get to your question, you are more than welcome to send an email to me, this is Anne, or to Roy. We can dig in and help get you the information that you need. I want to say huge thanks to Michael for being on the call today and presenting these results. They're going to be incredibly helpful to our coalition efforts to move the needle forward on securing relief for the childcare industry to respond to this emergency. And I cannot say enough how timely and how important these findings are, I think, to our collective efforts. Look forward to connecting with all of you. Please don't hesitate to reach out and stay tuned to your email inboxes for follow-ups, including the slides and the recording. Thanks again.